Now up ahead on World Tonight, as negotiation on the truce between Israel and Hamas reaches its closest point to deal, we speak with Michael Bosecchio, the Global Affairs Analyst and Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, to get his take on what this might mean for the war in Gaza. And Russia says it cannot coexist with Kyiv's current regime, but will keep pushing as long as needed to fully demilitarize Ukraine. Updating tonight's top stories, a suspected rocket launched by North Korea prompts an emergency warning on the Japanese island of Okinawa. South Korea says Pyongyang's ballistic missile likely carried a military spy satellite into space. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says hostages could be released soon as negotiations on the truce with Hamas reaches its closest point to a deal. Chinese President Xi Jinping calls for an immediate ceasefire and the release of detainees as BRICS leaders hold an emergency meeting on the situation in Gaza. And for more, Michael Bosecchio, the Global Affairs Analyst and Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, joins us live from Rome. Michael, good to have you with us. Now, tell us, how significant is this truce if it comes through?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So I've just returned from about 10 days in Israel and East Jerusalem, and I just flew in a few hours ago from Jordan. But this is what we're hearing. The proposed deal would involve about 50 hostages, although the Israeli press is reporting it could now go up to 80. And this would be exclusively women and children. It sounds like it would be exclusively Israelis. And in return, there would be a 4 to 5 day pause in fighting, and in return also three Palestinian prisoners being held by Israel would be returned for every hostage. So this is a very, very big deal. On the humanitarian side, a pause in fighting, of course, would allow more humanitarian aid, which is very, very badly needed. Almost 2 million people displaced under very difficult conditions. As we speak, there are reports of Qatar, which is hugely involved in brokering this deal, that they're flying more aid to Egypt for anticipation of this deal happening. But I have to say, when I was in Israel, this was such a huge deal, the hostages being kept by Hamas. There was real rage, but also, Israel is such a small place that everyone appears to know somebody who was either killed or injured or taken hostage. So it's really impacted the country. One more point to illustrate how big a deal this is for Israel to actually be releasing Palestinian prisoners. In 2011, they released over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners and released for one imprisoned IDF soldier who was in captivity for about 5 years. Now, there's about 8,300 Palestinians being kept by Israel, and about 460 are women and youth. So there are a lot of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails to choose from to put into this swap deal.
Indeed. And as we anticipate this truce deal coming through, can we expect both sides to uphold the deal, especially that the truce will entail a pause in violence, which in the past Israel has vehemently disagreed to?
Well, look, I've been covering the war in Ukraine for 2 years, and the first part of that war, we were dealing mostly with non-state combatants, and it's very, very difficult to get agreement from them to uphold these deals. And then, can Hamas be trusted? I doubt the Israelis have much trust whatsoever in them. But, when I was in Israel, I really felt that domestic pressure on the Netanyahu government. Families doing these long protests from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, posters all over the place, hashtag bring them home all over. So the pressure on Mr. Netanyahu was on very thin political ice even before the war began, is absolutely enormous. But they're going to be treading with this very carefully. And then one more thing is, it's not only Hamas holding hostages, reportedly, it's other militant groups as well. So it's a very, very complicated deal.
Now, Michael, as you mentioned earlier, this is a significant truce deal if it comes through. But with decades of animosity between Israel and the Palestinians, could this deal perhaps mark the end of the war, you think?
Well, everyone hopes so, because every red line you can possibly imagine has been crossed. I'm a former spokesperson for UNICEF and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and we used to talk about red lines in the humanitarian aid business. For example, when churches or museums or mosques are struck, when Mariupol was bombed so heavily. But I don't think at that time we could ever imagine what we're seeing happening right now in Gaza, such a massive displacement of almost 2 million people to the south, but also complete decimation of the northern part of the Gaza Strip, rendering it uninhabitable, the cutting off of electricity, telecommunications, food and water. It makes me wonder, a lot of countries are ratcheting up their rhetoric or their criticism of Israel, but it doesn't need to come to the point where we actually see starving bodies, people walking around, skeletons popping through their skin for more action to be taken. I mean, this is just catastrophic humanitarian disaster that we've not seen before. So something needs to happen. Peace needs to come to the Gaza Strip, because we're going to see a much, much higher death toll as the weather is worsening right now. Wind and rains have been there for the past 2 days.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for your insights, Michael. We're speaking to Michael Boursiquot, the Global Affairs Analyst and Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you. Russia is standing firm that it cannot coexist with Kyiv's current regime. Moscow insists it can resist the might of NATO as long as it needs to fully demilitarize Ukraine.
Нынешний режим, который существует на территории Украины, он подтвердил то, что он является абсолютно токсичным. Никаких вариантов сосуществования с ним мы на данный момент не видим. Поэтому все, что сказал президент, максимальная демилитаризация, денацификация той территории для того, чтобы избавить ее от внешнего влияния, внешнего управления, который по факту опасен для Российской Федерации, для жителей России. Поэтому, как только будет ликвидирована эта опасность, это можно считать достижением цели, которые были поставлены перед специальной военной операцией.
As Russia's war against Ukraine enters its 21st month, the United Nations Human Rights Office reported that more than 10,000 civilians have been killed, though it expects the real death toll to be significantly higher. Close to half of the deaths in the last 3 months occurred far beyond the front lines of the battlefield. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claims that since the war broke out, there have been at least 5 or 6 Russian attempts to assassinate him. However, all were foiled by his security services. As part of the crackdown against corruption in Ukraine, criminal proceedings have been launched after the Defense Ministry discovered that the military unit misused more than $1 million of government funds. Ukrainian authorities have sought to root out graft in the Defense Ministry in recent months to reassure Western allies sending wartime aid.